The stench of human urine mixed with Europe's most expensive perfumes, golden halls where nobles defecated behind curtains, and marble corridors transformed into open-air latrines. On the 6th day of May, in the year 1682, when Louis XIV officially transferred the French court to Versailles, he created not only the most magnificent palace in history, but also the most unsanitary and repulsive environment ever inhabited by European aristocracy. Behind the golden facade that dazzled ambassadors and kings lay a reality of filth, disease, and sanitary degradation that transformed the ultimate symbol of absolute power into a hygiene nightmare that defies modern imagination. This is the story of the most extreme contrast between appearance and reality in the history of European monarchies. Versailles was not merely a palace, but a failed social experiment where tens of thousands of people were forced to live in conditions that would make a medieval beggar recoil in horror. What happened within those golden walls reveals how absolute power can create monsters not only political but sanitary, transforming luxury into a disguise for the most absolute human degradation. To understand how the world's most beautiful palace also became the most repugnant, we must examine not only its majestic construction, but also the brutal reality of daily life that unfolded behind its facades of marble and gold. Louis XIV had conceived Versailles as the supreme demonstration of French royal power. In the year 1661, when construction began under the direction of architect Jules Hardouin-Mansart, the objective was to create a palace that would surpass all others in Europe, establishing France as the dominant cultural and political power of the continent. What the Sun King did not foresee was that concentrating all of French aristocracy in a single location would create logistical problems that would transform his dream into a sanitary nightmare. The construction of Versailles lasted decades and consumed a significant portion of the French treasury. In 1682, when the court definitively transferred to the palace, the structure housed approximately 20,000 people, nobles, servants, guards, and various officials. This population concentration in a building originally designed as a hunting residence created infrastructure problems from the very beginning that were never adequately resolved. The first and most serious problem was the complete absence of an adequate sanitary system. Versailles had been built without a single public latrine, without a sewage system, and without any planning for the basic physiological needs of its inhabitants. The architects, obsessed with aesthetic grandeur, simply ignored these practical considerations, assuming that architectural magnificence would be sufficient to solve all problems. The immediate consequence of this negligence was the transformation of corridors, stairways, and even noble halls into improvised bathrooms. Nobles and servants, without alternatives, relieved themselves wherever they found a discreet corner. The famous gardens of André Le Nôtre, admired throughout Europe, were regularly used as collective latrines, creating an obscene contrast between landscaped beauty and scatological reality. During the winter of 1683, the first complete year of court operation at Versailles, the sanitary situation deteriorated dramatically. The cold prevented people from venturing into the gardens for their physiological needs, concentrating all excretory activity inside the palace. Contemporary accounts describe how it was impossible to walk through the corridors without stepping on human excrement, and how the smell had become so intense that even courtiers accustomed to palace life showed visible signs of disgust. The situation was particularly problematic during official ceremonies. The ritual of the Liver du Roi, where hundreds of nobles gathered in the royal chambers to witness the king's awakening, regularly transformed into an olfactory ordeal. The accumulated smell of dozens of people who had not washed adequately mixed with the odor of excrement that permeated the entire palace, creating an almost unbreathable atmosphere. Madame de Maintenon, Louis XIV's secret second wife, wrote in her private letters about the impossibility of maintaining any hygiene standards at Versailles. She described how it was necessary to burn incense constantly in her chambers to mask the stench that penetrated through the walls, and how her clothes absorbed the nauseating odors of the palace, making it necessary to change them multiple times per day. The problem intensified during the grand banquets and festivities that Louis XIV regularly promoted to impress foreign visitors. With hundreds of guests gathered in the halls for hours on end without access to adequate sanitary facilities, physiological needs created situations of extreme embarrassment. Diplomatic accounts of the era describe how foreign ambassadors were forced to relieve themselves discreetly behind curtains or in corners of the halls during official ceremonies. The Duchess of Orléans, the king's sister-in-law, recorded in her diary a particularly revealing episode that occurred during a ball in the year 1687. During the presentation of a musical piece, a high-ranking noble could not control his intestinal needs and defecated in his own clothes in the middle of the hall. The incident was discreetly ignored by all present, demonstrating how court etiquette had adapted to the deplorable sanitary reality of the palace. The absence of adequate heating systems aggravated all hygienic problems. During the rigorous French winters, Versailles became a frozen environment where water froze in washing basins. The impossibility of staying clean in such low temperatures, combined with the lack of sanitary facilities, created living conditions that bordered on medieval primitivism. In the year 1689, a dysentery epidemic swept through Versailles, killing dozens of courtiers and leaving hundreds of others seriously ill. The epidemic was directly attributed to the deplorable sanitary conditions of the palace. But instead of implementing structural reforms, Louis XIV chose to intensify the use of perfumes and incense to mask odors, treating symptoms instead of causes. The situation of women at Versailles was particularly dramatic. The elaborate dresses of court fashion, with multiple layers and rigid structures, made it extremely difficult for court ladies to attend to their intimate needs. Many developed chronic urinary infections from avoiding urination for hours, while others simply urinated in their own clothes, depending on intense perfumes to disguise the odor. The food system at Versailles also contributed to sanitary degradation. The kitchens, located far from the main halls, were connected by corridors where accumulated sewage regularly contaminated food during transport. Cases of food poisoning were frequent, further aggravating the intestinal problems that affected the entire palace population. During the reign of Louis XV in the 18th century, timid attempts were made to improve the sanitary situation. In the year 1728, some private latrines were built for use by the royal family, but the general population of the palace continued without access to adequate facilities. This partial solution only accentuated the division between royalty and nobility, creating a sanitary hierarchy that reflected the extreme social stratification of the era. The situation became so notorious that foreign visitors began to comment openly about the degrading conditions at Versailles. The English ambassador reported to his government that the French palace, despite its architectural magnificence, was habitable only for those with dead nostrils and iron stomachs. These international descriptions began to undermine France's reputation as the center of European civilization. In the year 1755, during a visit by Madame de Pompadour to the royal chambers, an incident revealed the extent of the problem. The royal favorite inadvertently stepped on human excrement while climbing the main staircase, staining her white silk shoes in front of a delegation of foreign ambassadors. The embarrassment was such that new etiquette rules were created prohibiting the use of light-colored shoes at Versailles. The supreme irony of Versailles was that the more magnificent the palace became externally, the more degrading the internal living conditions were. Constant renovations and expansions increased the resident population without solving the fundamental infrastructure problems. In the year 1770, during the reign of Louis XVI, Versailles housed almost 30,000 people in sanitary conditions that had progressively worsened over nearly a century. The situation began to have serious political implications when Versailles' reputation as a symbol of aristocratic decadence spread among the French population. Revolutionary pamphlets of the late 18th century described the palace as a golden sewer where the rotten nobility lived in its own filth, transforming sanitary degradation into a political metaphor for the corruption of the old regime. Marie Antoinette, aware of the problem, tried to implement some improvements during the 1780s. She ordered the construction of private bathrooms in some wings of the palace and established stricter rules about personal cleanliness. But these limited reforms were seen by the population as additional evidence of her disconnection from reality, since they completely ignored the sanitary problems affecting France as a whole. The French Revolution of 1789 definitively ended court life at Versailles. When the revolutionaries invaded the palace, they found not only symbols of aristocratic luxury, but also physical evidence of the sanitary degradation that had characterized noble life. Accounts from the invaders describe a palace where the accumulated stench of decades had permanently impregnated the marble walls. The cleaning of Versailles after the revolution revealed the complete extent of the degradation. Workers removed tons of human waste accumulated in corridors, stairways, and even noble halls. The decontamination process lasted months, demonstrating how decades of sanitary negligence had transformed Europe's most magnificent palace into a biologically dangerous environment. Modern analysis of Versailles as a social experiment reveals how extreme concentration of power can create paradoxically primitive living conditions. The palace that represented the apex of French civilization was, in reality, less hygienic than many medieval cities, which at least possessed rudimentary waste management systems. The contrast between external magnificence and internal degradation at Versailles became a powerful metaphor for the excesses of the old regime. The absolute monarchy's inability to solve basic sanitation problems in its own residence symbolized its inadequacy to govern an entire nation. The literal filth of the palace transformed into a symbol of the moral and political corruption of French aristocracy. Today, when we visit restored and decontaminated Versailles, it is difficult to imagine the sanitary reality that characterized its golden age. The perfumed and polished halls we admire were, for centuries, environments where luxury coexisted with the most basic degradation. The transformation of Versailles into a museum physically erased the evidence of its sanitary history, but documentary records preserve the memory of how absolute power can create monstrosities, not only political, but also hygienic. The story of Versailles serves as a reminder that architectural grandeur and political power do not guarantee basic conditions of human dignity. The most luxurious palace in history was also one of the least habitable environments ever created by European civilization, demonstrating how obsession with appearance can mask brutally degrading realities. The permanent lesson of Versailles is that true civilization is not measured by the magnificence of palaces or the complexity of court protocols, but by a society's capacity to guarantee basic conditions of health and dignity for all its members. The Palace of Versailles, in all its golden and putrid contradiction, remains an eternal testimony to how power without responsibility can transform even the most grandiose dreams into nauseating nightmares of human existence.